Ukraine's forces made significant gains on the front line. The armed forces liberated territory in the Kharkiv region, pushing occupiers back to the border. Joint Forces Group spokesperson Viktor Trehubov reported this during a TV marathon.
There is significant positive momentum in the Velikoburluk direction, where the Russians have effectively been driven back all the way to the border, and where they have lost control over 2 settlements over the past month. The Velikoburluk direction has now returned to the state it was in about a year ago.
In the Lyman direction, active fighting is still continuing. At the same time, Trehubov added that the Russian side is exaggerating its own achievements in this area.
There, the Russians have been completely lying about their so-called military successes. I looked at the map published by the Rybar resource. It does not correspond to reality at all.
Ukrainian forces have also achieved significant successes in the south of the Zaporizhzhia region. In particular, the defense forces have liberated Malotokmachka and Bilohirya, pushed the enemy out from the southern edge of the Uspenivska ravine and from southern Primorske, and have also advanced east of Plavny along the highway, according to the Institute for the Study of War. Earlier, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky, recently stated that for the first time since the beginning of the war, the number of attacks by Ukrainian defense forces has exceeded those by Russian occupation troops. Syrsky reported that in the Oleksandrivka direction, Ukrainian forces have already liberated about 500 square kilometers of territory and 12 settlements. The commander-in-chief stated that overall, Russia is suffering losses 3 times greater than Ukraine. Meanwhile, analysts from the Institute for the Study of War have noted that the Ukrainian armed forces have achieved their greatest successes since the Kursk operation. A series of counterattacks on various sections of the front has produced tangible results. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Ukrainian medium-range strikes have significantly reduced the Russians' ability to advance. Meanwhile, UAVs have begun reaching deeper into Russia more frequently. The Moscow region was previously subjected to a massive drone attack. Residents of the region complained about numerous explosions. Before that, there were also loud explosions in the temporarily Russian-occupied territory of Crimea. The Kacha airfield, as well as the area of Kazachia Bay, Inkerman and Sevastopol came under attack. When the Russian army was bombing peaceful cities and villages in Ukraine, many residents of the Russian Federation saw it as normal and preferred to remain silent. But after the strikes began to reach deep into Russia itself, the mood changed dramatically.
Honestly, I'm scared. What's happening in Russia right now is really no joke anymore. When it was happening somewhere far away, you could still think, okay, the chilling realization that it's already here, literally right there next to your own home. It's honestly quite terrifying to think about. And even when there are loud sirens and emergency warnings, we don't have any safe shelters in the city, just so you can understand the situation.
Meanwhile, in the Russian Federation, the Syzran oil refinery is on fire. This refinery is part of the so-called Samara oil refining hub of Rosneft, which also includes the Kuibyshev and Novokuibyshev refineries. The capacity of the Syzran refinery allows it to process up to 9 million tons of oil annually. On May 21st, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced that the warriors of the SSU Special Operations Center struck the FSB headquarters and destroyed a Pantsir S-1 air defense system in the temporarily occupied territory of the Kherson region. Hundreds of occupiers were affected. On May 20th, the UAV forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine struck the training center for UAV pilots of the aggressor country, the Russian Federation, and eliminated 65 cadets of the Special Forces Regiment Sever Akhmat, along with the head of the training center.
The security forces of Ukraine's defense delivered a powerful and unexpected counterstrike to the enemy. Special units of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, together with their comrades in arms, carried out a brilliant and extremely complex operation to clear the strategically important city of Stepnohirsk. During fierce fighting in difficult urban conditions, the forces of the Russian occupiers were completely driven out of their fortified positions, and key locations in the city came under Ukrainian control. However, analysts from the Deep State Monitoring Group urge people to look at the situation realistically. The enemy still has reserves and the combat zone remains dynamic. How exactly did the main intelligence directorate break through the enemy's defenses? What role did the recent change in Ukrainian command play? And why has Stepnohirsk now become a point of fierce confrontation? You can find more details in our detailed report. You are on the Glavred channel. I'm your host, Yevhen Serov. Like this video and subscribe to the channel. The strategic clearing of Stepnohirsk was an absolutely vital task. as Russian pressure in this specific area had recently become increasingly overwhelming. The occupiers did not stop trying to seize this bridgehead and even managed to penetrate deep into our defenses, particularly in the areas of the settlements of Rekhnoe, Lukyanovskoye, and Pavlovka. But the Ukrainian defenders not only stopped the enemy, they completely drove them out of these settlements and built on their success further. As our aerial reconnaissance units share, the success was preceded by colossal preparatory work. First, the defense forces systematically cut off the Russians' logistics. After that, a precise strike was delivered against the enemy's eyes. Ukrainian fighters identified and eliminated the Russian drone operators, completely minimizing their influence on the course of the battles. When the occupiers were left blind and without ammunition supplies, the GUR Special Forces assault groups entered the battle. They arrived at their positions in armored vehicles. The enemy tried to repel the attack with their kamikaze drones, but one of the FPVs, which attempted to ram our armored vehicle, was destroyed even before it reached its target. As a result, the enemy fortifications in Stepnohersk fell. Nevertheless, analysts from the Deep State Monitoring Channel note that work in this area has been ongoing for a long time, and it's too early to relax. On the map of Stepnohersk, the red zone of occupation has changed to gray, not blue. Why is that? The explanation is simple and honest. Despite colossal losses, Russian infantry still has certain reserves and constantly tries to infiltrate, slip through, and entrench themselves in the ruins of buildings. It's still too early to talk about full control and final stabilization of the area, but it has become many times harder for the invaders to carry out their plans. Deep State points out a particularly important detail. There has not been any significant recent reinforcements of Russian manpower in this area. This means they are steadily exhausting their existing resources. Currently, the defense forces are working tirelessly around the clock to thoroughly eliminate the remaining Russian groups scattered across the area, and finally bring this entire matter to a definitive close. Military logic and clear coordination between GUR assault troops, artillery, and drone operators have produced results. Seizing the tactical initiative in Stepnohersk disrupts the Russian General Staff's plans for a large-scale offensive on Zaporizhzhia and forces the enemy to panic and switch to defense in areas where they had planned their own.
To strengthen Ukraine's position ahead of a possible agreement and, accordingly, to force Putin to sign it as early as this summer, the European Union is preparing a new blow against Russia's shadow fleet. What other restrictions and punishments will be imposed on Putin's shadow fleet of tankers? Let's break down the details now.
This marks a new blow to Russia's shadow fleet. Brussels is preparing another round of sanctions against Russia. The primary focus of these measures will be the tankers of the shadow fleet, which assist Russia in exporting oil while bypassing restrictions, and provide one of its main sources of income. This is reported by Politico.
Tightening control over the fleet will help cut off one of the Kremlin's most important sources of income and increase pressure on Vladimir Putin to force him to abandon his maximalist demands in any peace agreement on Ukraine, EU representatives said.
According to Politico, the European Union's 21st package of sanctions could be adopted as early as the end of June or the beginning of July.
A blow to Russia's shadow fleet is likely what both Ukraine and the entire world are waiting for right now, because it is precisely thanks to the shadow fleet that Russia can continue to receive windfall profits from oil and invest them in the war. No windfall profits, no money, no war. It's a fairly simple logic which, unfortunately, hasn't worked fully so far because the Europeans have constantly been looking for ways to both protect themselves from any price fluctuations on the market and at the same time somehow put pressure on Russia. That's why all of this has been ineffective.
It is widely anticipated that the new package of sanctions will also specifically focus on Russian banks, financial institutions, and defense industry companies, as well as firms selling stolen Ukrainian grain.
That is precisely why consistent strategic measures are needed that would actually allow us to exert a meaningful influence on Russia, to maximally restrict the ability to transport Russian oil, to block all European Union ports for the Russian shadow fleet, and even to intercept these tankers. just as some European countries have recently attempted to do. In other words, if, for example, the Baltic and Mediterranean seas are actually blocked for Russian oil, then that's it. Putin will have no other options but to enter negotiations and end the war.
In Brussels, they believe that the Russian economy is experiencing its most difficult period since the beginning of the war. That is why now is the right moment to increase pressure on Moscow.
Russia is suffering from a static inflationary shock. That is why, in G7 and bilateral meetings with representatives of the United States, we stress that now is not the time to ease pressure on Russia, said EU advisor Valdis Dombrovskis.
As Politico writes, Ukraine, which former US President Donald Trump accused of lacking leverage in negotiations with Russia, now has much more influence than even a year ago. The EU loan of 90 billion euros, Ukraine's significant strategic advances on the battlefield, its growing ability to produce its own long-range weapons, and the profound psychological impact of disrupting Moscow's traditional Victory Day parade celebrations on May 9th, all of these factors contribute to a very positive dynamic.
90 billion euros and the sanctions are working. They provide momentum and put Ukraine in a much more advantageous position. This momentum must be maintained, said a senior official from the national security of a NATO state.
Ukraine's allies are currently suggesting that a summer sanction strike could play into Kyiv's hands, since Hungary now has a newly appointed Prime Minister, Peter Magyar. It is highly possible that a lasting truce will be reached in Iran, and the US midterm elections in November may once again bring back and focus Americans' attention on the peace process.
And Europeans should not be afraid to demonstrate significant strength on these issues. The seizure of tankers, blockades, fines, and other similar sanctions are things that can truly have a profound impact on Russia. Without this, it will be completely impossible to force Putin into real, substantive negotiations.